All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As I said, I'm Alice Grossman with the ENO Center for Transportation, and I am going to turn the webinar over to Jeff Davis, our Senior Policy Analyst and Editor for ENO Transportation Weekly, and he has done a good roundup of what happened with the Omnibus late last night, and he's going to go over all of that. Give it to you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, those who are at the computer here can look at the presentation there that I've put together. The cover page is on there, and the title is the FY18 Omnibus. All that money, wow! Because there's just an unbelievable amount of money in this bill. Slide, please. It's $1.3 trillion just in this bill. And it's $1.2 trillion in regular appropriations, subject to the spending cap. $629 defense, $579 non-defense, and then $78 billion for overseas contingency operations, war, Afghanistan, Iraq, global war on terror. $7 billion for disaster relief, $2 billion for program integrity adjustments, and $2 billion for the Cures Act. It's about $1.3 trillion, really. And then once you add the $126 billion in appropriations that are emergencies, mostly hurricane relief, that were enacted last December, you're up to close to $1.4 trillion discretionary appropriations for FY18 released through the first 6 months of the year. Slide, please. Now, you'll remember that when the budget deal that made this extra spending possible was negotiated last month and released, there was a sort of deal memo that the bipartisan congressional leadership put out promising where certain amounts of the extra non-defense money was going to go. One of the things they promised was that an extra $10 billion in 2018 and another $10 billion in 2019 would go to infrastructure, based against the FY17 levels. Defining infrastructure is kind of in the eye of the beholder. The Appropriations Committee is saying they've got $21 billion in there for all manner of infrastructure. That includes transportation, energy, water, cyber, housing, electrical grid, broadband, things like that. I don't know enough about a lot of those non-transportation, non-public work things to really hazard a guess on what's an increase. But I was able to find appropriations for the main infrastructure programs, not operating, just infrastructure, at DOT are about $7.2 billion above the 2017 level. And that's not counting ships and shipyards. I was interested to find out, actually, that the Congressional Budget Office counts Coast Guard boats as being part of infrastructure. And all those big studies they have about transportation and water spending since 1956, Coast Guard boats are included as infrastructure capital. So, and if you want to count some maritime stuff at DOT, there's several $100 million more that could be counted infrastructure. The Corps of Engineers programs are about $790 million above FY17. The various EPA water supply programs are 673 over. So that's about $8.9 billion right there, just on the stuff that I normally file and can count easily. Government-wide, there is certainly enough more in there to get over the $10 billion mark, and probably by most people's definition to the $21 billion mark that the House Appropriations Committee says it's using. So you can definitely say that the $10 billion infrastructure promise is one that has been kept. Slide, please. The $1.2 trillion is split between the 12 appropriations subcommittees, and this is a chart here that just shows how they divided up the extra money. The $138 billion increase is actually a 13% increase over last year in basic appropriations, and the defense obviously got the biggest one because the defense increase was what got Republicans on board with the spending increase, and then Democrats insisted on significant non-defense spending increases to be able to buy into that. Labor HHS got $16 billion, and the next biggest increase was Transportation-HUD at $12.6 billion. They got $70.3 billion for the Transportation-HUD subcommittee, as opposed to $57.7 last year. It's quite an increase. And the next slide here will show you that exactly. Slide, please. The $70.3 billion at FUD is a net number. All those numbers are net. They're net of rescissions, and they're net of the HUD offsetting receipts from mortgage insurance premiums for federally insured mortgages. Now, the previous high net for this subcommittee was in 2010, was $67.9 billion, or peak Obama. And the thing is that the 2010 bill came along in a time when the housing market was in collapse. So the HUD offsetting receipts had basically collapsed to less than $1 billion a year. Now those offsetting receipts were $10 billion. And also the bill doesn't really have any rescissions in it. So now if you look at the actual gross appropriations before the rescissions and before HUD offsetting receipts, this new bill is $80.3 billion. And that compares to $69.3 in 2010. So we're now spending, this bill, $11 billion more than the peak Obama spending year of FY10. The FY09, counting the ERA spending, was probably more, but these numbers generally don't include emergencies. So we're $11 billion more than the previous peak in FY 2010. Slide, please. And this is a graph just showing the gross and net lines from 2007, which was the first year the current subcommittee jurisdiction was assigned. Before that, it also had the Treasury Department and the Judiciary and DC and some other stuff that's not really comparable. But as you can see that we've really bent the graph down. I actually had to, it broke the y-axis of my spreadsheet. I had to adjust the y-axis to really fit it in here. Slide, please. Going by mode, we'll start with the big one, highways. $47.5 billion for FHWA. The FAST Act obligation limitation of 44.2 was met. All the FAST Act obligation limitations in this bill for FY18 were either met precisely or exceeded, plus the extra $739 million in exempts. And it's topped off with $2.5 billion in general fund appropriations for federal aid highways to supplement the rest of that money. $1.96 billion is for basically the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, but only the very first line of STBGP. Highways and bridges. None of the other stuff allowed for under STBGP is allowed. And also, there's no takedown for transportation alternatives for this money. So it's hard highway money, not soft highway money, as some people like to say. And it'll be apportioned not by the contract authority apportionment formula, but by the ratio of obligation limitations in FY18 once that gets distributed. So you can look at the preliminary FY18 distribution on the FHWA website, divide your state's total by the subtotal for all states, multiply that by 1.96, and come pretty close to what your state's going to get. There's $320 million for federal and Indian lands and public and territories, and there's $225 million for a new discretionary bridge program for states that have a population density of less than 100 persons per square mile. So that's about half the states. I think Texas is Texas is just too high to qualify. They're 106 per square mile. And the FHWA is directed to use the latest Census Bureau numbers in determining population density. But they're encouraged to go for programs of bridges rather than single bridges. But pretty much it's a competitive program that DOT is going to get to select the winners and losers. Now, because the bill is chock full of money, there was no reason for them to have to resort to gimmicks to balance their books, so there was no reason to have a rescission of Highway Contract Authority, so there's not one. The House bill had an $800 million rescission, zero in the final bill. There is a provision that allows states to transfer Highway CMAQ money to state-supported route Amtrak projects. That was originally in the Senate bill. That made it into the final version. Once again, they allow states to reprogram dead earmarks that are more than 10 years old and have 10%, fewer than 10% of their funding obligated. And I believe it still has to go to within 50 miles of the original earmark site. And there's a provision in there that frees up the grandfathered toll credit money that was for toll projects that were negotiated under the 1987 highway law, as long as the locals can certify that the facility is being properly maintained. Some of that money will be freed up to use elsewhere. Slide, please. Mass transit. There's $10.6 billion for transit formula grants, and that includes the $9.7 billion FAST Act knob limit, which again is met to the penny, and then another $834 million from general fund appropriations given to various programs under the transit formula grant rubric. $400 million for the State of Good Repair formula program, $30 million for the High Density State formula program, $400 million for bus and bus facilities, and that's split up between bus formula, bus discretionary, and NOLO in the same proportions that they are under the FAST Act. And then $4 million for bus testing facilities, one for the one in Altoona and $2 million for another place. $2 million for Altoona, $2 million for some other testing facility not named. So that all goes out this year. And then the big news is on the Capital Investment Grant Program, it's $2.645 billion, which is $232 million more than last year. It's got another $399 million for new starts that don't have full funding grant agreements yet. So the two Minnesota projects, Seattle Linwood, Santa Ana Streetcar, are going to be eligible for that if they can convince DOT to sign their full funding grant agreement. And then there's a bunch of money, $516 million for future core capacity projects that don't have FFGAs yet. Now, they dropped the $400 million that the House bill had put towards the 5309Q set aside for joint Amtrak and mass transit rail projects. That was where Chairman Friedland put some of his gateway money. They dropped that set aside. So it appears that the gateway programs aren't as good a fit for CIG now because they're, Amtrak as the lead sponsor is kind of a weird fit for CIG. But a lot of that money was wound up going towards the core capacity projects instead. There's $401 million for small starts. And again, it's impossible for Congress to direct DOT to put money in specific projects in this program without violating the earmark ban. The Senate bill had some stronger language in there trying to direct DOT to put projects that get medium or above ratings into, to force them to give grants. They don't do that. They do order DOT to obligate 85% of this money by December 31st, 2019. So they got to give it to someone by then. And the report language also orders DOT to update project ratings whenever a sponsor changes their application and requests a new rating. And that's also about Gateway because DOT kind of upset the New Yorker and the New Jersey people when they rated both the Gateway projects, the Hudson Tunnel and the Portal North Bridge, as medium-low last month, which means that they're not eligible statutorily for any CIG money at all unless they get re-rated. So if they can redo their financial plans, they can get another shot at DOT without having to wait the full year for the FY20 New Starts report. And the bill also provides the full $150 million in grants to WMATA, and that's the ninth installment of the $1.5 billion that was promised in Tom Davis's legislation that was in the 2008 PREA Act. Slide, please. Looking at aviation, the FAA gets an even $18.00 billion this year. That's $1.6 billion over last year. A modest increase in ops of $186 million, which is mostly just the controller salary increase and the workforce attrition issues. Facilities and equipment gets a big $395 million bump. That's part of the infrastructure money that goes mostly towards next gen and particularly the datacom. And then on airport grants, it gets the full $3.35 billion obligation limitation on the contract authority under the various FAA extensions, and also another $1 billion from the general fund in addition to that for AIP, but it's for discretionary grants only, and it's for non-primary airports and for non-hub airports and small hub airports. So medium and large hub airports are not going to be eligible for that $1 billion. And then they also beef up R&D a little bit by about $12 million. The legislation in the end, but Division M, I think, also includes a Airport and Airway Trust Fund extension through December 31st. That's 8 months, I think. So it's otherwise going to expire at the end of March, 9 months. But it's going to, so it extends those through December 31st to give Congress more time to work on a FAA authorization bill. Now, because the FAA authorization bill is actually going to move, we think, that gave the House additional leverage in trying to get the Senate, trying to get the conferees to drop a bunch of the Senate provisions that were aviation authorizing legislation in the Senate Appropriations bill. So they dropped the provision that allowed, in the Senate bill that would have allowed airports to increase passenger facility charges at originating airports by up to $4 per head. They also dropped the Cuba provision and the aviation promotion provision and the cell phone call on airliner ban provisions that were in the Senate bill, but not in the House bill, which all involved rewriting Title 49 in some way. There's also $155 million for of discretionary money for the essential air service subsidies, so that nobody has to get cut off for budgetary reasons this year. Slide, please. On railroads, the big news again, there's no language implicitly directing any funding to the gateway projects. There's a big boost for Amtrak. The Amtrak Northeast Corridor grants get $650 million, which is almost double what they got last year. Now, according to a press release from Democrats in the Senate, Amtrak estimates that $388 million of that could be spent on gateway. But again, Title 49 gives the Secretary of Transportation the authority to deny the specific requests for capital funding uses that Amtrak has. The grants don't go directly to Amtrak. The grants to the Secretary of Transportation to pass through and then give to Amtrak. So people need to reread that section of Title 49 that describes the grant approval process, because it's not as simple as Amtrak just saying, hey, we're going to spend this money on gateway. There is some kind of DOT role in approving that money. Grants to the national network are $125 million more than last year. And about of those three new grant programs that were established by the FAST Act, the CRISI program, Consolidated Rail Infrastructure, gets the most this year. $593 million, which is like $525 more than they got last year. $250 million of that set aside for PTC grants, and they're setting aside $35.5 million basically to rebuild that infrastructure from the Sunset Limited that was torn up by Hurricane Katrina, so you can again take Amtrak from New Orleans to Orlando and rejoin the rest of the Sunset Limited from Orlando to Los Angeles and increase and lose more than $400 a passenger once again, like the good old days. The federal state partnership SOGR grants get $250 million, but again, they dropped the House language that was more or less directing that money to the gateway programs or projects, and the restoration grants get $20 million. Now, there's $25 million there that's kind of new for the RIF loan program for credit subsidy costs. Traditionally, RIF doesn't rely on appropriations for credit subsidies. Instead, the credit subsidy cost is paid for by fees paid by the borrowers. But there's language there's $25 million in the bill to allow appropriations to be paid for some to support some RIF credit subsidies, and there's also language directing DOT and OMB to rank these loans by cohort and do some other things that will allow the program to function a little better. The legislation also drops, once again, the House-passed language that would have cut off federal funds for the California High-Speed Rail project. Next slide, please. The Tiger Grant program gets $1.5 billion. That's 3 times as much as they got last year. It's as much as it first got in 2009 in the ERA stimulus bill that started the program in 2009. They're going to take $25 million off the top for oversight, leaving $1.475 million left for grants. They're maintaining the $25 million maximum grant size, so 59 grants maximum, probably more than that. The state share is maintained at 10%, so the cumulative projects in any one state can't exceed 147.5. The rural set aside is increased from 20% to 30% of all grants. But again, this is the Trump administration we're talking about, and I believe they've had 60-some% of the FY17 Tiger were rural. And they're bringing back planning grants. There were planning grants allowed in Tiger in 2010, and then in 2014, and now in 2018 again. So up to $15 million can be given out for planning grants with no minimum size. And the Senate bill took a hard line and was trying to force the administration to use the Obama administration's FY16 selection criteria for FY18 Tiger. The final bill doesn't do that, but it does provide, quote, the Secretary shall not use the federal share as a selection criteria in awarding projects, unquote, which basically prevents DOT from using Tiger as an advance on their incentive grant program from their infrastructure initiative. Slide, please. At safety programs, there's $845 million for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It's all OBLM, but extra OBLM in there, 201 more than last year, which repurposes old contract authority for new things. In particular, they're starting a DOT-wide autonomous vehicles research and development program, using $100 million in old CVISN contract authority repurposed. $60 million is going to be for demonstration grants to non-private entities. I think 38 is going to be for running the research program itself across FMCSA and NHTSA and FTA and highways. It was part of DOT's AV 3.0 aim to synchronize autonomous vehicle policy across all the modes of surface transportation. And then there's also $87 million in extra ob limit for border crossing infrastructure. NHTSA gets a $36 million increase from last year. There's an $11.5 million supplement from the general fund, GF's general fund, for a grade crossing safety media campaign and an innovative DUI solution media campaign, and $272 million for PEMSA. Next slide, please. In terms of water resources and navigation, everybody in Congress loves the Corps of Engineers, and they get a $789 million increase over last year. Most of it in ops and maintenance, and then a little bit in the construction. But remember, the Corps just got $17 billion in money, emergency money, 3 months ago. So at some point, you run into a limit of the Corps' ability to give money out and hire contracts and do things. So any dream of boosting the Corps' regular budget higher than this probably wouldn't have done much good, because they've still got $17 billion in emergency money that the ink's still wet on, they're trying to give away. The Bureau of Reclamation has a $176 million increase for its water resources programs, a 10% bump for the St. Lawrence Seaway, and MARAD gets a $457 million increase, almost 50%. But again, that's a big $300 million bump for buying a new training ship for the State Merchant Marine Academy, the State Merchant Marine Academies. That's something the administration recommended. The administration wanted to use as much of this extra money as possible for one-time purchases that didn't create long-term expectations, and the MARAD ship is one of those. And the rest is for the Marine Academy. Next slide, please. In terms of water supply, the Clean Water Act State Revolving Fund capitalization grants and the Safe Drinking Water Act SRF grants at the EPA both get a $300 million bump. Now, if you look at the bill, it's kind of misleading, because the Interior Subcommittee put all its infrastructure money in one section at the end of the bill that then reached back and plussed up other accounts throughout the bill. So you got to read the section in the EPA budget and then read section 430 at the end that puts more money elsewhere. But yeah, so $300 million each for those, and then the WIFIA in the last year had $5 million for program overhead and then $5 million for subsidy money. And that was gonna, and if they did that this year, that was also like one of the Senate or House bills. That was going to that $5 million in subsidy money was going to support $610 million in loan volume. They added another $53 million to this program, $3 million for admin and $50 for credit subsidies. So that's $6.1 billion in loan volume on top of the $610 million. So that's $6.7 billion in in new WIFIA loan volume that can be supported by the appropriations in the omnibus bill, which is, you know, a good start. And slide, please. And last but not least, transportation security. Not much news at TSA. Everything's pretty much standard. They meet the budget requests for the K-9 teams, and anyone who's been through DCA lately when they've been on alert is very happy that going through the K-9 teams lets everyone get treated like they're TSA pre, even if they're not. The bill rejected the administration's proposed aviation security fee increase like they do every year. The Coast Guard gets a $1.7 billion increase, about $300 million of it's ops, which is mostly military pay. The bulk of it is buying new national security cutters in the AC&I budget. Over at FEMA, there's another $100 million for port security grants like last year, and another $100 million for mass transit and rail security grants also like last year. And they maintain the $10 million Amtrak set aside and the $2 million over-the-road bus set aside. So that concludes the PowerPoint part of the webinar, and I'd be glad to take any questions you have now.
All right, we've got a bunch of questions coming in. Folks, if you have any questions, you can just type them into the question box on the side panel on your screen. Let's go through some of the ones that have come in already. Jeff, did you say that the AV dollars for the FMCSA can be used not for the FMCSA?
That is correct. The $100 million in repurposed FMCSA contract authority from years back is for a joint DOT-wide initiative on AV research. So it's specifically, there's pages 21 through 24, I think, of the joint explanatory statement for the Transportation-HUD part of the bill lay out a lot of restrictions on this money, but it's explicitly joint FHWA, FTA, NHTSA, and FMCSA autonomous vehicles research. A certain amount, I think, $5 million for SAE levels 1 and 2, and then the rest of it for SAE 3, 4, and 5. And even some of that, I believe, $500,000 of that money was for the secretary to reorganize the way the entire department does AV stuff. So yeah, it's that money is that $100 million is not, even though it's from the FMCSA budget, it is by no means restricted to FMCSA.
All right, thank you. Okay, here's another one. Under the highways portion, is there money that's specifically supposed to go to the Highway Safety Improvement Program?
Only the amount of money that was part of the the $44.2 billion Federal Highway Administration ob limit from the FAST Act. You know, whatever portion of there that the FAST Act had scheduled to go for HSIP goes to HSIP, but none of the $2.5 billion in extra general fund money goes to HSIP. States, I guess, are always free to transfer it there using their uniform flexibility, but as it is, it's not required to go there.
All right, and a couple of people have asked, what does this mean for fiscal year 2019? Is this automatically going to be the baseline? What do we think FY19 is going to look like, even moving into 2020 also?
They should be getting at least as much money in FY19. Again, the promise of $10 billion for infrastructure was $20 billion for infrastructure, 10 in 18 and 10 in 19. So, and the discretionary spending cap goes up even more. So we can expect that the FY19 appropriations will be about the same level. We are, of course, setting ourselves up for a gigantic fiscal cliff in FY20 because I believe the spending caps will drop by about $150 billion collectively in FY20 compared to what we just set them at for FY19. And they'll have to do some other kind of last-minute brinksmanship deal contortion thing to be able to raise the tax again. But it's just like, there's no such thing as a temporary tax cut, and there's really no such thing as a temporary spending increase. Once people get to the new normal, they like to stay there. And specific accounts may vary from year to year. But I don't know how much old CVISN contract authority was left unspent at FMCSA. It can't be much more than the $100 million they're plugging this year. So that research program will have to come out of general fund money or something like that next year. And some other sources may move around, but the aggregate levels for the Transportation Department are probably going to be about the same in FY19 as they were in FY18.
Got it. Did the bill include any additional funding for federal highways emergency relief?
No, it does not. Again, there was some of that money that was enacted in December, I believe, as part of the last hurricane, or maybe even in February. There was some of that for the territories and just general ER backlog in that $125 billion tranche of emergency appropriations that had been enacted from October 1st to last month. There was some FHWA money in there. I can't remember how much, but there's nothing in this legislation for emergency relief. I'm not sure what the backlog in ER is since that last slug of appropriations last month came through.
All right. And there's a few questions here going back to Gateway. Can you expand a little bit more on how Gateway might or might not be able to use specific funds that are directed towards Amtrak?
Yeah, Amtrak, the Northeast Corridor appropriation for Amtrak was pretty much doubled. And in theory, Amtrak could, put well over $350 million of that money to Gateway-related projects. However, Title 49 gives the Secretary of Transportation a role in approving the individual projects that Amtrak decides to fund using this money. So, and again, just because most recent secretaries of transportation haven't apparently done much micromanaging of Amtrak and Amtrak's capital in that fashion, doesn't mean that the current administration won't. There's also something weird in there. It's section 24319 of Title 49 governs the secretary's approval or disapproval of Amtrak's request to spend this money. There's also something in 24319G says that the money can't be used for, quote, capital costs of commuter rail passenger transportation, unquote. So, and to the extent that a lot of the gateway money is more about Jersey Transit than it is about Amtrak, I'm not sure what that means. If it might give the administration a leg to stand on in fighting that money or not. Now, Mr. Schumer pointed out this morning that there's $430 million in new transit formula money in the bill, the general fund, above and beyond the FAST levels. And under the FAST Act formulas, New York and New Jersey collectively should get about $150 million of that. And if they want to, plug that money towards any of these gateway projects, they are more than welcome to. There's no real disapproval process at the federal level on that. But again, read 49 U.S.C. 24319, and you can really get a sense of the degree to which the Secretary of Transportation could do a sort of line item veto, in essence, of Amtrak's capital spending request using the money appropriated by Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And again, also the administration could change its mind and decide to start signing full funding grant agreements for Portal North Bridge first, and then once the EIS is done for the Hudson River Tunnel, promising $7.5 billion of future appropriations to that. But they've given no signs that they're going to, unless New Jersey and New York drastically change the way they want to fund their local match.
Yeah. How many programs have received additional funding above the FAST Act levels, and what does that mean?
Highway and Transit collectively got, let's see, how much was it? It was about $3.4 billion in general fund money, supplementing the contract authority, supplementing the formula contract authority programs. There was actually, I think AASHTO had written asking for $4 billion for the highway and transit formulas, split 80-20 highways transit. They got about 3.4 split 75-25. However, the highway money, again, doesn't allow transportation alternative set-asides and doesn't allow any of the transit stuff or some other things that surface transportation block grant money could normally be used for. So it's highway and bridge only, not a lot of that other stuff. So that sort of makes up, I guess, for it being 75-25 instead of 80-20. There was the $1 billion, and then there's the let's see, above FAST. Where is it? Yeah, the three rail grant programs at FRA were authorized by FAST, and those are $363, $342, and $75 million above the FAST. Sorry, 363, 75 above the FAST Act authorization levels for the good repair and the consolidated good repair, respectively. Amtrak was authorized at 1.6 in FAST, and it's going to be 1.94. And capital investment grants is 340 above the FAST Act authorization level, but that's more controlled by the appropriators. The authorization level was to flatline anyway, sort of placeholder. And in terms of contract authority, the obligation limitations, the dollar amounts were precisely met for every obligation limitation except for the FMCSA Motor Carrier Safety Grant, which had that extra 187, 100 for autonomous vehicle research, 87 for border infrastructure.
Uh-huh. And here's a good follow-up. Going back to the Gateway, could a case be made for Gateway to be described as a core capacity project?
The Portal North Bridge is already a core capacity project, and many of the other Gateway projects are core capacity. But the Big Daddy, the Hudson River Tunnel, is a new structure, and I believe it's not, it being a completely new tunnel, separate from the old tunnel, not connected. I'm not sure it's eligible for core capacity. The the Gateway people had not applied. They haven't put it in the core capacity pipeline anyway, but it was in the New Start pipeline and not project development process and not the core capacity process. But Portal North Bridge and presumably Portal South Bridge and some of this other stuff that's farther on down the road could be core capacity.
Overall, do you think what's the relationship between this bill and the infrastructure initiative and that plan that's come out? And what do you think the relationship is and the implications between one and the other?
I know that some people on the authorizing committees were kind of concerned that if the appropriators did their job too well and put a ton of money in there for infrastructure, that it would lessen the sort of political need to pass separate infrastructure legislation. Funding wise, we've already got 8.9, I think, for just regular surface transportation, aviation, and water infrastructure above last year. I presume you would maybe deduct some of that from the size of whatever separate infrastructure legislation you were thinking about. And the fact that this money is good for next year is going to show up again next year as well. Also doesn't really help the authorizers in their attempts to get a bill passed that has a separate set of infrastructure dollars controlled by the authorizing committees and not the appropriations committee. So it's good for infrastructure. This omnibus is. It's not necessarily good for the prospects for passing a separate infrastructure authorization bill.
Mm-hmm. Are the $100 million for TSA grants for mass transit available for hiring like police officers and for transit authorities, or does that not fall under that category?
I honestly don't know. I'd have to look, but the current bill does not change the eligibility. This is an ongoing program that's gotten $100 million a year for like the last 8 or 9 years, and I don't think the rules have changed that much, at least in the last couple of years. So if that FEMA, and they got a pretty good website describing what's in the program. So if it was eligible in the last year or two, I'm sure it's eligible again under the current bill and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. So for this bill moving forward, do you think there's going to be any problems with its passage, any changes that need to be made, or is this it?
I think this is it. The Democrats were mad in the House that it didn't address the DACA Dreamer issue. So they tried to take down. This bill was negotiated with a large Democratic buy-in at the leadership level, and the ranking members of all of the appropriation subcommittees are completely bought into this. The Democrats this morning in the House tried to take down the special rule that allows the bill to come up, which wouldn't actually change the bill, but that passed 211 to 208, I think, just narrowly. But the bill itself passed the House 1 o'clock today by, I think, 256 to 167. Wide support from both parties. Now it goes to the Senate, and we may have another, short government shutdown if people don't agree to stampede this thing. But it's pretty certain that it's got 60 votes in the Senate without change. I don't know whether it will be able to get that passed by the midnight tomorrow night deadline, because that involves all 100 senators have to agree to really accelerating the timetable to do that. If even one senator doesn't agree, then you might have to wait till, I think, Sunday afternoon would be the earliest you could have the vote. So you might have a short Saturday, Sunday government shutdown again, but that's not that big a deal. And but again, I believe that the hardest hurdle is over. I believe it's got 60 votes in the Senate. The Democrats in the Appropriations Committee are excited about it. Schuster and Durbin signed off on it, so I believe the fix is in. And the president has said, after a long amount of waiting yesterday, in which because the problem is the Democrats were out first with their summaries yesterday morning, many of which are bragging about how they rolled Trump. So I think Trump went a little rogue yesterday and was talking about vetoing it. So the speaker had to go sit down with him at 3 o'clock yesterday and walk him through it. And so it took till that's one of the big delays in getting it. The text filed last night was the speaker had to go handhold POTUS. But the White House has now confirmed that Trump has tweeted that he will sign the bill. So I believe all the major obstacles are now passed.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. Did the Title VI see an increase beyond authorization levels?
The what?
Title VI?
Title VI of what?
I'm not sure exactly if the asker of that question wants to specify further. Not sure on that one. All right, well, I think it's time to wrap up. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you very much, Jeff. Title VI of the FAST Act. We can go over that real quick.
What was Title VI of the FAST? I don't have the titles memorized.
Sure. We can check in on that and update it.
We'll email it, but whoever it is, we'll email you later.
I'll email it out. Yep. All right. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.